All right, don't worry. You can have a king and a fox on the same table. They can share space. They don't fight. They don't kill each other in the middle of the night. Everything's fine. They all get along. So shocks don't know. Let's start with this one. Smaller shock, 3-inch piggyback. Good piggyback bridge here. I don't like the 90s. But honestly, there's enough flow in this. The 90s probably don't affect it because it has a lot of flow. Finned reservoir. Finned reservoir in the piggyback condition does better than in the remote condition. Why? Well, about that much of that shock is full of nitrogen. The rest of it's full of, that's how much oil gets exchanged. So to say there's no heat exchange with the fins and all that is wrong. There is some heat exchange, and more of it goes through this bridge here, actually in this direction than that direction, and helps dissipate heat. The nitrogen temperature is not all that critical. It's oil temperature that's critical, and honestly you're only cooling this much, and you're putting oil in and out from the same plane, so you really don't get oil from about here until it's circulated a lot. We can talk about coolers on another video. And we have some cooler shocks in, and I'll explain how they work. The finned reservoir has some cooling capacity, but in my opinion, and it is Wayne's way, it's not as effective as a circulating cooler. But this is a Good King pre-runner shock, 3/4 inch tubes, overlap design. You can see overlap design, so you got both tubes starting at once and then ending and then picking up and then bump zone. No trim tube, none of the short stuff for rebound and compression. Single rebound tube. I don't know what this is off of, but I think it's a leaf sprung vehicle, which this is a good application for this shock. A leaf sprung vehicle would be. I think we've talked about it before, but I'll talk about it again briefly. Remember, acceleration and inertia are the two measurements of energy, or the two conditions of energy that we deal with most in shocks. Inertia, because a heavy vehicle traveling at a given speed wants to continue traveling unless acted upon. And so if you drive that thing into a big hole and it starts to fall down in, it's going to use a lot of energy to get it going the other direction or going up, and that uses up the spring and the shock, and that's when you need to dissipate all that extra energy from that hole, or that hole hitting that face on the other side. You have to dissipate that energy with oil restrictions through the piston and the bypass tubes. And what a bypass tube does is it allows the initial travel to be soft, so you can take some of that contact energy that sometimes the wheels are still traveling out and then they have to stop, turn around, and go back. And that's a lot of inertial energy. It's hard for the vehicle to do that with no damping, with no other external force. And so you need to make it as light as possible to get that tire to stop, turn around, and then go the other direction. And then once we have it going the other direction, then we can start slowing it down through stages with oil restriction. And that oil restriction is just squishing hydraulic oil through a small orifice, and that creates heat. We're just converting kinetic energy, that's the motion, to heat. That's all a shock's doing on a first principles basis. So that's why the bypass tubes are stacked like they are, and they're better this way. There's a phenomenon of oil acceleration in the tube, and it's a bigger force than you think as well, because if you have a lot of flow and you're trying to accelerate through this small tube, it's going to cause another inertial force in there that you feel in the chassis. So if you can have the 2 tubes or the 3 tubes or the 4 tubes stacked together like this, and accelerate the same amount of oil but over more tubes or more area, and then once it's accelerated, that inertial force is for all intents gone. It's not gone, but it's not, to keep it going is not nearly as much as to get it going. And then when you start closing off tubes, you don't have to re-accelerate oil if there's a tube stacked, here instead of here, and then bump zone. So that's why tubes are stacked the way they are, and why they look like this. Let's talk about the reservoirs. We got a piggyback reservoir that would be called, and a remote reservoir, and you'll notice that the reservoirs come out the bottom, and that's to prevent cavitation. And cavitation is in a coilover shock, when you press the oil up in this shock really hard. If the reservoir comes out here and you push hard enough, you'll make that internal floating piston that is in the reservoir when it comes out the top, you'll just make it push, which causes a low pressure on the bottom side of the piston, wherever the piston is, and high pressure on the top, and the oil squishing through there is very easy and is going fast enough that it literally, since it's high pressure going into a low pressure, it boils or shears, what that's referred to as shears. The molecule shears from a liquid to a gas, and that causes bubbles. And two things prevent that. One, the nitrogen pressure in the reservoir. It makes the oil more stable, so that's why it presses down hard and applies force to the IFP, and that causes the shear to be way higher, just like putting a pressure cap on your radiator. You boil water at 212, I think it is. I always forget if it's 212 or 216, but you boil water at 212, but then you put a 20-pound radiator cap on it, and it's not boiling at 250. So that's the same thing that happens here. But with the takeoff down low like this, you're pressing hard against the solid surface, and the oil can't go anywhere. So it has to go through the piston, and then it goes out into the reservoir. So it's not pushing on the IFP with any force other than the shaft, the amount of material, so the amount of oil displaced by the shaft. And here's a little fun fact I don't know if I've said is, if you wonder if you have a race series or a pre-runner series king, if it is etched in the body cap like this, like laser or chemical etched king, it's a pre-runner series. If it is engraved, like with a CNC ball nose or something, it is a king series. Now, that's not to say that somebody hasn't put a conversion kit to have race seals in this particular shock. This one has not, but some do. And then also the race piston and some other better parts, race shaft and other parts. Fox has a different way of doing it. They've always just done, when it's a bypass, it's a race series. They don't have two series of bypasses, and they just make the one. And then they do have two series of coilovers. One's a performance series and one is a race series. And the race series is better with better shaft material. In my opinion, a little better shaft attachment to the eyelet, more selection in eyelet. What else? It's available custom, where you can get custom valving stuff, which you can't in the performance series. Those are just made to sell and put on Jeeps and sandrails and whatever they put them on, and then you have to valve them or do upgrades if you want to. But that's just a little side note. So this Fox 3.5, and this is the way a 3.5 should be built in my opinion. 1-inch tubes, bottom reservoir, -12, which is sufficient. Big reservoir, big enough reservoir that it's got a lot of air mass, so we don't have a high build of nitrogen pressure. Lots of room for nitrogen, so we don't have a high build of nitrogen pressure when the shaft does plunge. Also, the bigger the nitrogen space, the more consistent it is through heat. Plenty of room in that reservoir for temperature growth, like the oil, when it gets hot, it does grow a bit, and so that has to go somewhere, so it goes into the reservoir. We can talk about that a little bit. It might be something for another video, but I hear people all the time say nitrogen doesn't expand with heat. That's not true. Everything expands with heat. There might be an exception to that rule, but I'm not aware of it. So everything expands slightly with heat. Inert gases, i.e. nitrogen, argon, freon, some of the other inert gases expand on a very linear rate. We know exactly, consistent linear rate, we know exactly how much they're going to expand, and it's linear. It's not excessive. It doesn't have a spike in it somewhere where at a given temperature it goes off the charts like water. Water is a liquid until it turns into steam. Then it's a gas. Might have my numbers a little wrong here, but they're pretty close. The area of a molecule of water is X. Don't know what it is exactly, but it's X. And then you expand it to the same molecule in the gaseous state, same mass, but the area is like 1,700 times as big. And so that's why we don't use ambient air, because there's enough moisture in ambient air that it will expand so much that will cause high pressures. And yeah, we've all done it. Did it on a motorcycle when I was learning shocks back in the day because I didn't have nitrogen. The compressor's good. I got a dryer and blew up the shock about the third lap, and learned not to do that again. And so that's why we use nitrogen, and that's why you have to have room for expansion of any fluid. Any gas, fluid is a gas, gas is a fluid, and any fluid when it gets hot. So let's go over the parts of a bypass shock. They do the same thing, so I'll show you this one because it's a little bigger. Okay, so we got 3 tubes, all stacked, all starting at the bottom, and they flow together, so that's good. The short tube ends here, leaving about 50% of travel. Mid one ends here, leaving about, I'm wrong here, leaving about 60% of travel. This leaves about 75% or 50% of travel. This leaves about 75% of travel, and then it finishes off. That's not exact, but that's a give or take. And so that's how they work. And the oil, as the piston's running up, comes in here, flows down, goes through a check valve, which these control, and these are a 20 pitch thread, so about 50 thou for every revolution. I'm going to do that math, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. And so they close the tappet. The tappet can pop off when the oil comes this way and back into the shock. They close off the distance the tappet can travel, and therefore controlling force, because they're more restricted. The area of this orifices of fly that flows back into the shock, the more force we make in the shock while trying to push the fluid. And you open these up a long way, a lot of oil can get around the piston, so the shock doesn't make a lot of force until you get here, and then it makes force. And so that's the benefit of these, of little force in early travel. So when the shock's out, it can hit, it can get light force and then start to get heavier force, and a little bit like catching a baseball thrown by Nolan Ryan. You don't lock your arm and stick your glove out. You watch the ball come in. As it comes in, you relax your arm and start it moving backwards so the ball hits your glove, and then you stop it slowly in a 2 or 3 foot area, in your glove like that. And so you still have a hand left after he throws that ball to you. We all remember most of us remember playing baseball with our dad, and first time he threw it at you, you were scared, and then you learned to catch it, and then after a while he was scared when you threw it. So so that's shocks. Same basic parts. Here's a little tidbit. This is called the bypass tube, and this is the bypass housing. And this little standoff right here is literally ordered on the Fox website as a widget, which is awesome in my opinion. I don't know who named it that, but I believe I know, and I think I've shaken his hand. And if it's somebody other than that, I still think it's pretty cool that they named it a widget. Yeah, so let's look at a big shock really quick. Same thing, same basic thing, but let's look at the biggest shock we have in the shop and see what questions come up. All right, big boy today, off a Herp's truck. Yep, off a Herp's truck. I believe it's an 18. Could be wrong. Could be 20, but I believe it's an 18-inch, 4.4 Fox. Piggyback reservoir, same condition. It's a 5 tube. You'll notice it has a hose coming off one of the rebound tubes, and it comes off below the check valve. So technically the port it gets its fluid from is down here. And then you'll see another rebound tube, but it's facing the wrong way. but that doesn't matter because it is going in the rebound side because it blows off the check valve, but it can't get back out this way, so it is a rebound tube just because of the location and how the check valve works. Typically, if the rebound tube was way down here, it would be turned around, but since it's not rigid, it just matters of oil direct flow direction. So, I hope you can see that okay. Yeah, I think so. So oil comes out this tube in the rebound event. Extra flow goes around because this might be restricted some. Comes through this tube, goes through the shotgun cooler, which is a good cooler. Is a good cooler because there's fins inside of it, and these are Y-shaped, lots of surface area for what they are. Goes through across this bridge, which has a -4 port, maybe it's -6, I think it's -4, that you can put a sensor or whatever you want on, also to bleed it from, and then back through here, and then in and back into the shock to be distributed down and then come up again. And that is a good way to run a cooler because you're literally getting full flow of the shock. You're taking it from as low as you can on the shock and putting it on the top, and that's how to get heat dissipated more efficiently. Same basic shocks that we talked about before. Compression tubes, 2 rebound tubes, and a piggyback reservoir, nice and big, and then a shotgun cooler, nice and big. Yeah, and this particular truck has done its fair share of winning and is usually competitive and always competitive. Does its fair share of winning. Good team. I like these guys, and we've done a lot of work together. This truck ride's good. So. How do I look? My hair pretty? You can't see me. That's okay. We'll just shoot it. Okay, so here's a set of shocks on a Ford Bronco leaf spring. Pretty nice job here. We were talking earlier about the stacked and overlap tube design. And this is a bypass shock. It's a King, 2.5-inch King pre-runner. Has 1/2-inch tubes. We'll get into that in a minute. Compression tubes because they're pointing down. Compression tube pointing down and rebound tube pointing up. As the piston goes up this way, the fluid comes out that port, down there, through the check valve and back into the shock. And this is the adjuster. And depending on how open or closed the adjuster is, it's how much fluid bypass shock. This is the stack design. It's stacked because you have one tube starting at the bottom here, and the piston never gets below this. It usually starts about right there. And so, piston here, you hit a bump, the fluid is accelerated as the piston travels up. The fluid's accelerated through the tube. The restriction happens here, and that's what makes the force of the bypass tube. Since it's further open, it makes less force. I guess the bypass tube doesn't make force, but that's how you control overall force in the shock with the valving on the piston and how much fluid is bypassing in the given position on the shock. So piston comes up, this tube shuts off, this one starts again, and then you get above that tube and you're in the bump zone. This is a relatively old design. Some of the first bypass shocks that were position sensitive did this, and the problem with this shock is what we call oil acceleration. So in suspension, we're dealing with energy, we're managing energy. And so one of the things that causes the energy to happen is inertia. And we like inertia because when the truck or the car is traveling on a steady, on an even plane and hits a bump, the inertia of the vehicle allows it to stay in place while the shock acts upon, or the suspension, not the shock, the suspension acts and doesn't, upset the vehicle if done correctly. Another inertial force that is rarely talked about is oil acceleration. And so oil acceleration is a pretty big force. We could go over the equation if you want to. Let me know in the comments, and I'm happy to go over it. But in this video, since it's 101, we won't really do that. But oil has to accelerate through this tube as the piston goes up. So oil is accelerating, and then the piston gets to the end of the tube. And this oil is sitting stagnant. It's not moving until the piston gets into the position where it can, it's past this area. The reason it's stagnant is because the whole area above the piston is high pressure, so there's no reason for oil to go anywhere. It just sits there and gets squished. So as the piston gets above this area right here, then the oil has to accelerate again. And it doesn't seem like much, but you feel that. You feel that. You can see it on the dyno. You feel that. Once above the bypass tube, there's not an additional acceleration of oil because it's already a high pressure area and the piston squishes into it. Another thing that makes oil acceleration greater is the size of the tube. A bigger tube has to move the same amount of oil significantly slower with less velocity, is a better way to put it, than a small tube. A small tube has to accelerate the oil very fast or to a high velocity, which takes more force compounds on the cube of the velocity, and that is why the littler tubes don't ride as well as the bigger tubes. We can talk about that later when we get into another shock, but this is the stack design I had talked about that I wanted to show you stacked, because the tubes start and end here and then start and end there, rather than this tube coming all the way down, accelerating oil in both of them, closing off and continuing up, closing off and then being bump zone. Hope that makes sense. Stack tube design. So here's a fun one. This is a Kuster. If you heard my interview with Kurt LeDuc, he talked about Kuster and building the mining equipment, actually the oil drilling equipment. But this is a Kuster. This is the first attempt at bypass tubes. These are the stack design. Any bypass is better than no bypass, but these, in my opinion, well, they were good technology in their day, but we've come way past these. But really cool piece of nostalgia. This was obviously damaged, and that's why it was given to me, and I have it just in my cool parts shelf. So it's a pretty cool piece of history. I have a couple of white lightnings around as well, which are a cool piece of history. I'll see if I can't find one. I got a bunch more Kuster stuff too, some metering rod stuff, some cool stuff. At some point when I get the time to dig through my shelves, I'll find all that and we'll do a blast from the past kind of video. So thanks everybody for watching. This has just kind of been Shock 101. So when you hear me talk about things on a shock, that's what I'm talking about. If you have questions, stuff you want me to cover, feel free to post below in the comments and I'll try to put it on the list and do videos. I'm just going to try to go through the progression. Really, I'm going to hear the questions I hear the most on the phone every day, and those are the things I'm going to address. And hopefully as we teach people, the questions get more in depth and we can get more in depth in shocks, suspension, everything. We do it all at Alltech Motorsports. That's why it's called Alltech, because we do it all. We do everything from suspension to fabrication to machining to fuel fixes and several other things. We like getting right down to the heart of the problem and figuring it out. And let us know what you want to hear about, and we'll do our best. Thank you very much. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. It doesn't cost you anything. Helps me out if you subscribe and do all those things, and I get to do more videos. Thank you very much.